Hello and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Justin Bush, and I'm the coordinator of the Washington State Invasive Species Council, and I'll be speaking with you today about our Washington Invasives mobile app. We'll be providing an overview of the different services provided by the council, and as well as the app and how our reporting system works. We'll be also covering some updates on the invasive species reporting app and also some improvements. Just a note for housekeeping, we will have a live question and answer period at the end of the webinar. But if you have technical needs, feel free to ask within the chat box. And we do have Alexis Hafley here assisting today that will be able to help troubleshoot your webinar problems. And if during the question answer period you prefer to type out your question, Alexis and I will read the question and then answer it, or you can raise your hand and Alexis will unmute you. With that, let's go ahead and get started. So is background information, the Invasive Species Council was created by the state legislature to address the spread of invasive species. And I always like to start with a definition because we all have a different understanding about what invasive species may mean. So within our state law, it's defined as a non-native organism that causes economic or environmental harm and that is capable of spreading to new areas of the state. So there are a lot of different introduced species within Washington, but some just don't have the negative impacts to our economy or our environment. And some have been within Washington for up to 100 years, and they're just not spreading. And so at that point, we wouldn't call that an invasive species. We would define that as a non-native species or an introduced species, but it wouldn't have a threshold of damages such that it would be called an invasive. And invasive species can be any types of living organism, whether that's plants, whether they're terrestrial or aquatic animals, such as insects, amphibians. We'll see some land mammals later on. And something that's an emerging issue for invasive species are infectious diseases. One that's making the news frequently now is called white nose syndrome that's affecting bats nationally, that's just been found in Washington, and is something that the council's grappling with how to address. So why are invasive species an issue? Invasive species can sometimes take the form of predator fish, such as northern pike that preys on finfish and potentially could be affecting salmon in the future. Some invasive plants take over fields and natural areas and displace the native vegetation. Other insects, for example, can feed on our native tree species, eventually killing them or stunting their growth. Aquatic noxious weeds are a huge problem for recreation and sport fishing. If you're trying to boat your favorite lake and it becomes clogged with Eurasian water milfoil, that can be a huge problem. Other things can affect our ability to recreate. So if our shorelines were covered with razor sharp mussel shells, for example, of quagga zebra mussels, then you wouldn't be able to run around with bare feet. Or it may these invasive mussels may clog water intakes as well as hydroelectric dams and just really be a huge problem. Within the Pacific Northwest, we know that quagga and zebra mussels, for example, would cost us around $500 million a year to mitigate, in terms of keeping agricultural water systems running and hydroelectric dams functioning. And so that's a great example of something that we really want to keep out of Washington. So prevention would be our tactic there. And then some invasive species can grow taller and burn hotter than our native vegetation, so it can affect our wildfire regime. So a fire that may have historically been low frequency and low intensity, an invasive species may take over that area and it may burn taller and hotter. And so when a wildfire does happen, sometimes they can be more destructive. So the way that we approach invasive species management, first and foremost, is prevention. If we can take steps to make sure that invasive species aren't introduced to the United States and to Washington, then we don't have to actively manage it once it reaches our shores or our state. And that's primarily our first approach. And when something then is introduced in the United States, then we work really hard to make sure that it doesn't become well established within Washington. And from there, it just keeps scaling down. So if it becomes infested in Washington, one example would be cheatgrass. You can see the seeds are stuck in the laces of those hiking boots. If it's spread across parts of eastern Washington and rangeland, we want people to clean off their boots, to remove the seeds before they then recreate in an uninfested area. And so it's really the same prevention message, whether you're traveling internationally, traveling within Washington, or from one state to another. It's taking actions to prevent the spread of destructive invasive species, whether that's cleaning seeds from your boots, not releasing pets into the wild, if you're boating, to clean, drain, dry. And if you're traveling, always check and make sure that you're not transporting something that you shouldn't be. And what you can see on the screen in the lower right is actually someone that was traveling internationally with a live snake stuffed in their suitcase. So that's an x-ray of a snake. So certainly make sure that you're not moving live animals from one area to another. So what is the Invasive Species Council? The Invasive Species Council exists to empower those that work to prevent, detect, and manage invasive species, and it provides a forum and a strategic effort to address that across all jurisdictions and boundaries. And if you think about the spread of Scotch Broom, for example, if it's infesting your neighborhood and it's spreading across multiple properties, everybody's going to have to work together to address it. So if one neighbor chooses not to address that problem, then the other neighbors won't be successful in the long term. And it's really that same concept. So between different agencies and tribal organizations, federal partners, as well as nonprofits, everybody needs to be approaching this shared issue in the same way, so that we can be effective and efficient in the long term. Here you can see the composition of the Invasive Species Council today. We have 22 members ranging from state agencies to tribal government organizations, public utility districts, counties, regional organizations, nonprofits. It's really a great cross-section of different managers and decision makers that are all committed to preventing invasive species and managing them. We also have an industry advisory panel, and we realize that the government doesn't have all the answers. And so we really need to work with private partners and businesses to take a holistic approach in dealing with this problem. And so we have an industry advisory panel that's represented by Councilmember Seaman with Chelan County Public Utility District. And through that council member, we receive information for businesses and associations, which is a really great approach. And I work for the Recreation and Conservation Office, and I work on behalf of the Invasive Species Council. And if you're interested in learning more about the Recreation and Conservation Office, highly encourage you to visit. RCO is in Recreation and Conservation Office, period WA is in Washington, period GOV is in government, and learn about the great work that the Recreation Conservation Office is doing statewide in terms of salmon recovery, habitat, recreation, and other things that are a lot nicer to learn about than invasive species. So definitely highly encourage you to check that out. And moving on to invasive species. So I mentioned that there are a lot of different invasive species. The priorities of the council are shown here, and we see different categories: terrestrial plants, insects, aquatic animals, aquatic plants, infectious diseases, and terrestrial animals. These are the priority from a statewide scale. That doesn't mean that there isn't a local priority or maybe a species that is really widespread in one part of the state. So if you're looking at this and you say, gosh, Scotch Broom is a priority, that's really strange. It's found frequently in Thurston County, for example. Why is that a priority? And you'll see later on that at a statewide scale, it's actually not widespread in all of Washington, and we're effectively managing it in certain areas to prevent the spread. So in Western Washington, had we started this council 100 years ago, we probably could have kept it out, but we are effectively keeping it out of Eastern Washington. This is our priority species list. It's a group of 50 different priorities, and this is relevant because the app primarily focuses on these, although we do include noxious weeds is another way to say invasive plants. We try to include all noxious weeds. And in terms of prioritization, I just really wanted to share how the council approaches this. When we say that something is a priority, that has different meanings. So what this graph is looking at, you see the impact of species from low to high, as well as our ability to prevent their spread from harder to easier. And by plotting out a score used that we calculated using a statewide assessment tool, we're able to help the council prioritize our activities around each invasive species. So for some species, you'll see that we promote awareness, and it's really a great way to explain what we're doing. Some species, we're effectively preventing them, and so it's difficult for us to explain to the public what we're doing because it's not here. And so promote awareness would maybe be something that's gotten away from us, but it's just a great example of what we don't want with other species. Things that are widespread or more widespread, like Scotch Broom is a good example. Focused control in high value areas. So from a statewide perspective, we probably can't get rid of all of it, pull all the Scotch Broom. In a high value area like a park or natural area, we then would prioritize that higher. Whereas, from a county perspective that has a lot of Scotch Broom, you're never going to get rid of it everywhere, but you want to protect those assets that are really valuable. For things that are not yet here, we want to support detection, and where something is just getting established, we want to immediately control that. And then for something that's not yet here, we want to have really great strategies to prevent them from being established in the first place. That's really the best way to manage the issue is to prevent it up front. And a great way to think of that is like a wildfire would be a great analogy. If we can prevent a wildfire, then we don't have to spend thousands of dollars and bring a lot of people out to put the fire out, because the fire never started in the first place. And it's really the same approach that we're taking with invasive species as well. Elaborating that a little more, I wanted to introduce the invasion curve. This is a generalized invasion curve that the state of Victoria in Australia created, and I think it's a really great tool to help explain what I'm saying when we talk about prioritization and different scales of management. So you can see area occupied in terms of numbers of acres infested, numbers of feral swine, numbers of a lot of whatever it is that we're talking about, versus time. And so you can see when the species is absent, that's really where we try to focus on prevention. We want to do everything possible to keep that fire from starting. The very first start of the fire, as it were, whether it's one feral swine, one Scotch Broom, one insect, we want to find that very first entry, the very first insect, plant, animal, whatever it is, and we want to pull it, we want to capture it, we want to stop it from spreading. And when we can do that, we can effectively manage that such that it could be eradicated, meaning that it goes away. Where something can't be fully suppressed, then we need to essentially draw fire lines and figure out, how do we contain this? How do we protect the natural area? How do we protect the next watershed? How do we protect the next county, and et cetera? So that's really where we get to a containment. And then in the longest term, if something just really continues to spread and we don't have the resources in terms of people or money to contain it or eradicate it, meaning get rid of it forever. And we need to think about asset-based protection. And at that point, protect the best. If there's one property in a neighborhood that doesn't have Scotch Broom, for example, then we'd really put a high emphasis on protecting that, knowing that we can't get rid of all the Scotch Broom in the neighborhood. We can protect the areas that don't currently have it. So that's really our approach. It's really about being efficient, being effective, and realizing what our limitations are in terms of resources. So what we really need help with, and what leads me to this webinar today, is that the council and our network of partners created a new program. And we, thinking back to the invasion curve, I said that we really want to find that first detection, the very first population of something. There are a lot of experts looking for these species, but the fact of the matter is there aren't enough of us. And so we need your help. And that's where Washington Pest Watch comes in. So this is a network led by the Invasive Species Council. And the goal is not to actively search for invasive species. It's to be aware of invasive species, what the signs and the symptoms are, and then know who to tell if you spot something. It's really that easy. So, and why are we asking people to care? Well, 34% of Washington state lands are farmland. 54% are public lands. It's over 23 million acres. 37% of Washington state lands are timbered. We've got a lot to lose. We've got a lot of state parks, national forests, state forests, local parks. We've got a lot of great places to get out and enjoy the natural systems with your family, with your friends, to enjoy clean water and healthy trees. And invasive species are a direct threat to that and impact a lot of what we care about within Washington state. So the call of action is pretty simple. If you enjoy recreating in Washington and enjoy hunting and fishing and great outdoor opportunities, then you've got a role to play. And your role to play is to be aware of invasive species, take precautions in preventing their movement, and if you spot one, you should be letting us know. So we have numerous trainings for the network. We have in-person trainings led by Washington State universities and our other partners. We also have what we call on-demand trainings, which essentially is a webinar such as this, loaded to YouTube so that anyone can tap into that at any time. And our website that you can find trainings and recorded webinars is invasivespecies.wa.gov. And under council projects, you'll find a webpage called Washington Pest Watch. Currently, if you visit that page, you'll see information on upcoming in-person trainings, such as an Oregon Lakes Association and Washington Lakes Protection Association conference. It's a joint meeting being held in Portland this week. On the 28th, there will be an invasive species session, giving the perspectives both from Washington and Oregon about this shared issue. We also have two events coming up in the spring of 2019 that everyone should be aware of. The Columbia Gorge Invasive Species and Exotic Pest Workshop will be a day-long workshop in the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area in Stevenson. And then we are also holding a workshop in Bellingham that's a day-long, focusing on issues between Washington State and the province of British Columbia, that will be held March 28th. So if you're interested in this, I highly encourage you to visit our website and visit the webpage. And a really great way to track what we're doing is also through our email list. So if you visit invasivespecies.wa.gov, you can sign up for an email and get information sent directly to you. So reporting invasive species is pretty simple. See something, say something. We've got phone lines. If you see an aquatic invasive species, you can call a hotline number. If you spot a feral swine within Washington, Oregon, or Idaho, there's one 888 number that works for all 3 states. So I highly recommend saving that in your phone because you literally never know when a pig's going to run through your backyard. We also have a mobile app as well as a website. And something to note is that we're focusing on the mobile app today because of a recent update, But if you don't have a smartphone, or your phone is dead, breaks, whatever, you can always visit our website and file a form that mirrors the reporting app. So moving into the Washington Invasives app, there are 7 different steps to report an invasive species. And we're going to dive into each one here, and then I'll give you an example, 2 examples of what a report means once it's received. So the first is browse for ID information, and the categories are slightly different between the iOS or Apple app or the Android Google Play Store app, and we have the same developer, but the developer has different staff that create the app, and so they have all the options for the 50 species are the same. They're just shown differently within the different apps. So there's 4 different categories in Android. There's only 2 in the iOS app. One thing that's really nice about the reporting app is that it functions as a digital field guide. So you don't need to carry a handbook with you or fact sheets when you're recreating. If you're up boating, you probably have a dry bag that has your cell phone in it. If you're hiking, you always have a cell phone in case something bad happens. So we designed the app so that it functions as a digital field guide. So for any of the priority invasive species, you can pull up a little fact sheet, a photo, and see identification traits. So you no longer have to carry like a printed guide with you. At any point, you can pull this up on your phone and see if you found an invasive species. So the next step, say you've opened up your phone while you're hiking near a wetland, and you think you found flowering rush. There you can see an example of the digital fact sheet, a really great photo. What is it? If you were to have it open on your phone right now, you could see identification traits, as well as some information about native lookalikes. So say you'd found flowering rush, you then would tap report sighting, select F for flowering rush. And at that point, it opens up a map that drops a pin. And if you zoom out a little bit, you'll see a background with cross streets and kind of like a Google Maps type interface base map. And you can select the pin, so you can push it and drag it around, or you can drop a pin directly on your location using your GPS. One thing to note with the updated app is that we now have the ability to cache reports. So if you don't have cellular connectivity, you can still collect reports using your phone's GPS and then submit them later. And that does mean there's one additional step to reporting that'll be on our last slide here, but we felt like it was a really great decision because you may not always have cellular service when you're out hiking or biking or paddling. The next step is to add a photo, and so we highly encourage a photo, whether it's taken live or selected from your gallery, and that's because there are native lookalikes, and we really need a photo to help validate this and then route it to the appropriate responders. So there are 2 different options. You can either take a live photo, and that's the image on the left, or you can take a photo and then go into your gallery and select it and also crop the photo. You can see a sticker of our feral swine reporting sticker. That's something added for scale. And whenever you take a photo, we highly suggest adding something for scale, whether it's a pin, maybe your boot if you're hiking. You could even put your hand in the background so that our experts can look at that and know it's approximately the size of different species. And if you see a pig running through the woods, it's not really that important, but if you found a snail that you think may be Mediterranean snail, there are quite a few different snails to be found in Washington. We really do need to precisely measure parts of the shell to identify whether it is Mediterranean snail or not. So always include something for scale. The next step is to write a description or leave comments. The very first time that you file a report, you will be prompted to enter your name and your email address. If you've already filed one sighting report, that will be saved in the future. But what I recommend is think about how you guide someone to the site. always think about someone, maybe, so I'm stationed in Olympia. If you're reporting something at a park in Wenatchee, how am I going to navigate to that site to go pull that plant or capture that feral swine? Um, so think about how you should be explaining what it is, how many, and then what's the nearest location. So think about an address, cross streets. If it's a trailhead, approximately how far from the trailhead and what direction, etc. We're not requiring any specific information, but just use your best judgment trying to guide someone there that may not be very familiar with that site. The next step, so going back to the home screen, there's a button at the very bottom now called Report Queue, and this is a new feature with the new app update. And because we can collect information and cache it without cellular service, we need to add a report queue so that when you get back to Wi-Fi or cellular connection, you can then push that report into the database. And so if you tap report queue, you can see I have 3 queued up. You can tap any one and open it. You can then make changes, add additional notes. If your pin isn't in the right location, you can change the latitude and longitude, and then save that change before it's submitted. And once you have made all the changes and you're ready to give it to us, we'll click Actions and select the report or all the reports and hit upload, and you'll get a message letting you know that it's finished and if it's successfully loaded or not. If it did fail, turn on your Wi-Fi and try sending it again. And if that doesn't work, then certainly contact us and let us know that you're having an issue. So it's pretty simple. We try to make it as quick and painless as possible, and the help that you're giving us is really appreciated. So I always say never assume that someone knows about what you're finding. Always assume that no one knows that it exists and it's there. So whether it's something that's relatively common or uncommon, there's a lot of value to mapping it. So always file a report if you run into something. So what happens next? The moment you hit upload, it actually goes to our council email box as well as myself, and that's within 30 seconds. So just know that whenever you hit upload, someone's getting that report immediately. The very first thing that we do as staff is to do an initial verification. If someone's just testing the system or someone's reporting a common native insect, for example, we know that it's incorrect, and we're able to then verify it correct or incorrect, typically without working with any other agencies. So where something is incorrect, we always notify the spotter. And if a great example are invasive insects. There are native longhorn beetles that look somewhat similar to invasive insects like Asian longhorn beetle or citrus longhorn beetle. So if we find that, we always let the person know that's making that report that it is incorrect, that we really appreciate what they're doing. We'll actually share facts and information about that native insect. Some of our natives are pretty neat, and we want people to know what their life cycle is about and that they're not a problem. If something is correct, we then will notify the spotter that it is correct, as well as notify responders. And verification can take anywhere from 5 minutes to 5 days. If staff are unable to diagnose that species and validate it, we have a team of entomologists, of pathologists, of botanists that we then farm out the diagnosis to. So it could be that it would take a few days for our team to get that sighting report, and they may ask for more photos or more information, and potentially we'll do a site visit or ask you to capture a specimen. So zooming in a little bit on what happens next, if something is validated on correct, we notify the responders. And it's important to note that not every invasive species is considered and treated the same way. Some things are managed, other things are too widespread to manage in certain areas. Some managers are state entities that have funds and resources, some don't. Some are federal lands, and maybe there's a process to follow to do any activities. And so it gets to be really complicated. So managers can vary. Some species are regulated at the state level or the federal level, or even the local level. So there may be a manager that's responsible for taking care of a park, but that may be different than the regulator, which is the federal agency that's responsible for stopping the spread from one state to the next, or one nation to another. And then we also have researchers, members of academia from across Washington and even outside Washington that may be doing research in Washington specific species that are also interested. So for every species and every site, what happens next is different. And I'm trying to convey that there's not one answer. I guess the what happens next is a really solid it depends. And to help explain what I mean by that, going back to the invasion curve, something that is in the preventative status, so if we're trying to prevent it. My example that I'm going to highlight is feral swine. We don't have feral swine in Washington, so we're preventing them. But if someone were to find one, we'd then be near the entry of invasive species and approaching the area of eradication. And so for feral swine, we would be there. For Scotch Broom in Kittitas County, for example, that would be containment and eradication. So Scotch Broom is not well established in Kittitas County near Ellensburg, but it is spreading eastward from King County. What that means is there that they may actually be sending someone out to clean it up, pull the plants, keep it from spreading any further. But if you were to report Scotch Broom in Thurston County, for example, would probably be somewhere in asset-based protection where it's pretty widespread. There's a lot of it from a county scale, and the county office would be providing technical assistance to that landowner or that land management agency. So it really depends on site, it depends on the species, and really where it is and what the land ownership is as well. So one clear example illustrating this is feral swine. And if you look at our prioritization matrix, feral swine is kind of squarely between supporting detection and control and enhancing prevention. And it varies. We have had different feral swine found in Washington that have been eradicated where found. And so it does really kind of vary by the day on whether we're preventing it or supporting detection and control. Today, I'm happy to say that we are preventing feral swine. There are no known feral swine in Washington state. For anyone that's not aware of the feral swine issue, it's any member of the family Suidae. And within Washington, we would consider any pig or any swine that's out of captivity to be feral swine. So whether it is a domestic pig running through a park, or whether it's a pig that's really scrappy with long tusks running through the national forest, we would care. We would want to know either way. And I say that because feral swine can either be wild boar that were introduced to the United States back in the 1500s in the South that have been spreading north and east and sometimes in the back of pickup trucks, as well as descendants of domestic pig. So if you take domestic pigs and release them into the wild, over time, 3 generations to be precise, they revert to their feral tendencies. So the tusks start to grow back and they really do revert. So that said, we care about both equally. So feral swine are not yet in Washington. You can see in 2014 we had identified some feral swine, but they've been managed, and currently they're not known to be in Washington state. Why do we care about feral swine? Well, they destroy and consume crops. I just heard a story recently from someone in Georgia that spent $20,000 on landscaping their yard, and overnight a sounder, which is a group of feral swine, came in and destroyed the entire yard and essentially was lost. They also can prey on livestock, so ground nesting birds, they'll eat the eggs. They've been known to kill adult wild turkeys. Where they have tusks, they've actually been known to gore ground animals like baby deer, and it's really not a great thing. We've got a lot of different wildlife in Washington that could be impacted. The one that we're really worried about is our fish, and you might be asking yourself, well, why? What's the nexus between fish and feral swine? If riparian areas near streams and creeks are getting essentially tilled up by feral swine, when we get high water events and rains, that dirt will then be going into our streams, which can affect water quality. And that impacted water quality could impact fisheries like salmon. So feral swine really are a threat to salmon, which seems strange, but they've been known to have some pretty big water quality impacts in the South. And one of the things that is actually the reason why we get federal assistance nationally is because pigs can carry over 30 different diseases and parasites that are transmitted to people or livestock. And for some things like brucellosis, if that was introduced to a farm, a domestic pig farm in Washington State by a feral swine, then our State Department of Agriculture would then quarantine that farm and have to then inoculate and treat all the sick animals. And for some of these diseases, they would be fatal. So the whole crop could be lost, which is a huge impact to farmers. And so there are a lot of different widespread damages by feral swine, but the reason why we're most concerned is because they carry diseases that can be fatal or harm people or livestock. So here's a few more examples of what feral swine can do. Feral swine are both federally and state prohibited, and you can't move feral swine, or feral swine can't legally go from one state to another. They're legal they're prohibited from entering Washington, and then they're also prohibited to be on the ground in Washington. Where found, they'll be eradicated of and disposed of in a humane manner. So an example of a report, if you were to go hiking today in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest and come across a pig, we would want you to use your app to report it. If that were validated as being correct, we would let you know. And then we would also let the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife know. The Washington State Department of Agriculture, the department that's responsible for agriculture and domestic livestock, as well as the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Wildlife Services. And those three agencies have different roles in terms of regulation and management. Those three agencies work with the council to then initiate a rapid response plan. And so steps 1 through 8 are illustrated to the right. And for feral swine, for every single report, we follow the same process. Here's one example that was actually made through our app back in 2016. Member of the public spotted feral pigs, different age classes and sexes on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest near the 21 road near Packwood, and kind of squarely in between the Mount Baker, Snoqualmie, Okanagan, Wenatchee, and the Gifford-Pinchot. So really kind of the worst case scenario if pigs started to become breeding and well established. So within a day, we had someone out investigating, contacting the local landowner, which is the National Forest, gaining permission to enter the lands and do management. And it's a public land, but if you're working, there's actually some permits that need to be in place. And 3 days later, through a site investigation, the pigs were actually located at a rock pit and eradicated in a humane manner. So they were lethally removed. And then subsequently, there was monitoring that says it ended in 2017, but the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest actually has dedicated their own staff to doing monitoring now for feral swine. We believe that all of them were eradicated, but you never can be too safe. And this is one example, and we'll contrast that with a report made of Scotch Broom. So Scotch Broom is a member of the pea family, Faminaceae, and there are lots of different names: Scots Broom, Scottish Broom, Irish Broom. For my purposes, I'm going to call it Scotch Broom. And Scotch Broom is listed as a Class B noxious weed. So noxious weed is a legal term used for an invasive plant. So there are a lot of different non-native species where something is damaging to our environment or economy. For plants, there's a legal process of getting that listed on a state regulatory list called the noxious weed list. That list is broken up into 3 different classifications: A, B, and C. A being the worst, C being the most widespread, and typically is not legally enforced in terms of having landowners control that species. And Scotch Broom is kind of squarely located in the middle, and I'm going to explain why. But a Class B essentially means at a state level, the state doesn't enforce the law in terms of getting rid of it equally. So statewide, it may or may not be a priority is what I'm getting at. So going back to our invasion curve, Scotch Broom, I believe, has been within the Washington state for over 100 years. And so this is a great example both of containment, asset-based protection, and then prevention. If we could fully prevent it, there's a lot of land that wouldn't be degraded by Scotch Broom in Western Washington. And we're really trying hard to prevent that in Eastern Washington. So it's a good success story in terms of containment as well. So looking at our prioritization, Scotch Broom, indicated by a little sun icon, is between awareness and control in high value areas. So Scotch Broom in parts of Washington is really widespread. Eastern Washington is pretty widespread, or sorry, Western Washington, it's pretty widespread, such that it's just not going to be eliminated in every county, but it's not everywhere. And so in high value areas, parks, river corridors, grazing lands, knowing that it is toxic, focusing on control in high value areas, knowing that we can't get rid of all of it, is really an effective strategy. So yes, it may be along the highway corridor, for example, but it's actively being managed on the national forest. And so in terms of ecological use, we've really kind of focused on our highest value areas. And that's the general gist of it statewide. Here you can see the distribution from 2016 of Scotch Broom across the entire state. In parts of Western Washington, you can see there's more than 1,000 infested acres. And realistically, as a state, we can't get rid of it in those areas. But we can protect the best. We can protect the areas that are not yet infested and stop the spread. And then scaling up to the state level, you can see that it's not widespread in Eastern Washington, but you can see different corridors going into Eastern Washington where it's starting to spread. So Kittitas County is starting to get more, Chelan County is starting to get more, and Klickitat County is starting to get more Scotch Broom as well. So frequently in these barrier counties, landowners, whether they're state agencies or private lands, if Scotch Broom's found there, then the local noxious weed control board will work with that landowner to make sure that it's cleaned up by law. In Western Washington, Jefferson County, for example, if you found Scotch Broom and reported Scotch Broom, there's no legal enforcement to make the landowner get rid of it. But there are technical advisors that could assist with management for that landowner. Maybe there's cost sharing from through a conservation district, or the local weed board has a technical best management practice document that could be shared. So there are things that could be done in that instance. And what I'm saying is, if you report Scotch Broom within Washington, what happens next varies widely. So in this example, if Scotch Broom's verified as being correct, we notify the spotter, and then we notify the responders. And in this case, we would be notifying the local county noxious weed control board. And then if we can't identify the land manager, like a state park or a federal national forest, we then will also at the same time notify that same land manager. In a lot of instances, we don't know every private landowner and we're not able to contact them, but the county noxious weed control board has that relationship and they then would be responsible for following it. So just 2 different instances. So for 50 different species, you can imagine how complicated this would be, and we could keep going on for hours and hours. But the fact of the matter is, every report is being followed up on, and I would say that every report is beneficial. Even though something may not be actionable in terms of someone coming out to help you remove the invasive species, that information is useful because distribution maps are useful, both at the state level, the county level, and then what's really great is that our database is a national database stewarded by the University of Georgia. So anything that you report using the Washington Invasives app feeds into the national distribution map. And why is that useful? Well, if we're trying to get more invasive species controlled within Washington, a lot of times we're going to need state and federal assistance to do so. And if we can't justify the need in terms of a point on the map, acres infested, then it's really hard to ask for resources and to make it a priority. So what I'm saying is, like, you know, it may not be actionable in terms of someone coming out to help you, but if we can get enough information to then ask for federal assistance or to put together some kind of state funding package, then help will never come. So if you don't report it, nothing will ever get better. But if you do report it, over time, things may get better. So always assume that you're going to be helpful and report what you're finding. And so with that, we'll go ahead and transition now into question and answer period, and highly recommend, if you're interested in this topic, following the Invasive Species Council's Facebook page, Instagram, or Twitter. Our meeting minutes are great, but they're a little dry, so we'd highly recommend following us on social media. It's a great way to keep your finger on the pulse and see what work we're up to. So with that, Alexis, do we have any questions?
Not yet.
Go ahead here and wait a couple minutes. All right, well, if no one has questions, we'll go ahead and end. Thank you all for your time. If you do run into issues with the app, or you have questions about anything you heard today or any invasive species questions in the future, don't hesitate to visit invasivespecies.wa.gov and reach out. We're here to help, and we really appreciate your time today. And with that, we're going to go ahead and close. Thanks, everyone.